Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, a former prisoner returns to Afghanistan, where he was detained during the so-called War on Terror. What still haunts him more than 20 years later?
I returned essentially to a scene of a crime, and I think that those crimes have still not been uncovered fully.
I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
My name is Moazzam Begg. I am a senior director at the advocacy group CAGE. I'm a former prisoner of the United States at Guantanamo. I'm an author, and I'm happy to be with you today.
Moazzam, welcome to The Take. We're happy to have you. You are also the subject of a new Al Jazeera documentary, Echoes of Bagram, in which you travel back to Afghanistan for the first time since the early 2000s. You were imprisoned in Afghanistan in 2002 during the U.S.-led so-called War on Terror, which led you to Bagram.
Built by the former Soviet Union in the 1950s, the sprawling base has expanded since the U.S. invasion.
Can you tell us what happened after you were detained and sent there as a prisoner?
So primarily I was detained in Pakistan, and I was sent from Pakistan then into U.S. military custody. Now, Bagram was somewhere that I ended up spending almost a year in without charge or trial by the US military. And it was a very difficult place to be. And I often say that by the time I'd gone through Bagram, I was looking forward to going to Guantanamo. I was begging for them to send me somewhere far better than this place. It was a place of torture. It was a place of horrors. And I don't say that with any exaggeration. It was a place that I think most American soldiers would say it was a place of horror, especially because of the terrible things that were done there. And I'm an eyewitness to that. And that's the main reason why I returned.
You mentioned some of the crimes that you saw with your own eyes. I don't want to have to make you relive the details of these, but just share for our listeners, what were some of the abuses at the hands of U.S. forces?
So I'd been stripped naked, beaten, physically, sexually violated, as had all the other prisoners. It was a standard operating procedure almost. And after that physical violation, racial, religious taunting, but even that compared little to what was to come next. I was held in one cell and interrogated by both the CIA and the FBI for a period that lasted around a month. I was interrogated in total 300 times. But in this particular place, I was threatened by the CIA that if I didn't cooperate, I'd be sent either to Syria or to Egypt, where they knew that I knew the worst kinds of tortures take place. Simultaneously, while they were threatening me with this kind of extraordinary rendition, they subjected me to the sounds of a woman screaming in the next cell. And at this point, I didn't know what had happened to my wife, because I was seized in front of my wife and children in Pakistan by the CIA. And then they waved pictures of my wife and children in front of me and said, "Where do you think they are? What do you think happened to them?" And whilst that's happening, I'm listening to the sounds of this woman screaming in a way that is blood-curdling. I had no idea if it was my wife or not, because I've never heard anybody scream like that. But that's what they made me believe, at least for a while.
When you return to Bagram, as shown in the film, you walk around this massive warehouse-sized facility, which now has cobwebs and old packets of food from when U.S. forces were there.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, this is the full pack. That's the MRE. I remember this one. Department of Defense.
You have said that the scars from your time being held in Bagram are deeper than the ones from Guantanamo, where you were later transferred. What do you mean by that?
I think the worst crime that any person could witness is that of the killing of another person, the abuse of another person, and being incapable and unable to do anything about it. So in 2002, I saw the American soldiers beat to death a prisoner who was trying to escape from the next cell to me. That was the first. The second was what I later learned was a taxi driver called Dilawar. And he was tied, his hands were tied to the top of the door of the cage, the airlock area, where he'd been held for several days and was left like this, other than when he was allowed to eat or go to the bathroom. He remained like this with a hood over his head until his body slumped. The soldiers came in, they started to punch him repeatedly in his ribs to see if he was faking it. And then they took him off into a secret room.
The memories of what happened inside Bagram haunt Moazzam to this day. But it was just the beginning for him. From there, he was transferred to Guantanamo Bay and held until 2005. He has never been charged or put on trial by the U.S. That's why, since his release, Moazzam has dedicated himself to helping other detainees. His organization, CAGE, campaigns for those who are still in prison without trial. It's a cause he never expected to take on when he first moved to Afghanistan from the UK, where he was born. Can you take us back to the time when you were living there? What were you doing in Afghanistan?
Yes, so I came to Afghanistan in 2001 with my wife and children. We'd decided to work on a project that had already been started from the UK, which was to help to build a school for girls and boys separately. The Taliban were in power at the time, and we'd intended to live there for a while up until we saw these projects up and running. And it was a time when there was no social media. There weren't even any televisions in Afghanistan at the time. So the invasion, when it began, I wasn't really aware of the nature of the response of the United States of America, or the intended response to 9/11.
When Moazzam returned to Kabul with Al Jazeera last summer, there were barely traces of his former life left.
I couldn't recognize the street. I could barely recognize anything because everything had changed so much. There was a flood of emotion that had come into me and over me when I finally realized that I'd walked onto the street where I'd used to live.
I never cry. I've been filmed for 20 years about the worst abuses. I've never cried in front of a camera, in front of everyone. It's the first time.
I was standing in front of the door where my kids used to come in and play, where my wife was, where we'd lived at least for some while before the US invasion of Afghanistan started, and my life changed forever from that point.
I'm curious, why did you want to go back after so long and after so much had happened?
Well, the return to Afghanistan wasn't something that I'd actually envisaged. I thought that that's a part of my life that's pretty much over. I have been campaigning since my release for the past 15 odd years from Guantanamo for the release of prisoners who were held without charge or trial, and that includes Afghan prisoners. So there was that part of it. But really, for me, it wasn't about returning to the home where I lived as much as it was to the prison where I was held for over a year and witnessed some of the worst crimes I've ever witnessed in my life, and that includes murder.
After the break, how do the echoes of Bagram still resonate in Afghanistan today? Moazzam spent about 3 years in total in prison, despite never being charged and with no way to prove his innocence. That's the same struggle faced by Mohammed Raheem al-Afghani. He's the last Afghan prisoner in Guantanamo Bay.
Raheem has been held for over 15 years in Guantanamo without any charges at all, without any opportunity to defend himself or disprove any allegations against him.
That's Mohammed Raheem's lawyer, James Cannell. He spoke to Moazzam about their efforts to get Raheem out of Guantanamo.
Of course, he knows that other people are being released. He does have hope. The team that we've been able to put together will be able to convince the members of the intelligence community what is obvious to anyone who knows Raheem, which is that he poses no danger to the United States. He's not an extremist in any way. He's not a radical. He's a 57-year-old man with severe health problems who deserves to go home.
Pressure has been building for the U.S. to release all Afghan prisoners. In February, 2 other former detainees who spent 14 years in Guantanamo were allowed to return home. They were also never charged.
The Taliban has said that Abdul Zahir Sabr and Abdul Karim have been released. The pair was held at Guantanamo until 2017, after which they spent 7 years under house arrest.
So, Moazzam, you met with Mohammed Raheem's family and others in Afghanistan who've been trying to secure his freedom for years. What were those meetings like?
I've been to Afghanistan now a few times. I'm currently here now, and I meet with the family regularly. They've now become friends. I've met with Mohammed Raheem's mother, who's in her 80s, who told me herself that she lost 2 sons to the occupation of the Soviet Union. Both were killed. So she said that she'd like to see her son before she dies. And so she's a very old woman. And Mohammed Raheem's sons, I've met Ibrahim, Ismail, Dawood, and they've had a terrible time growing up without a father. So it is now high time that he gets released and is able to be reunited with his children who have actually grown up. They're full adults. Both of them are working, but he is lost and they have lost any concept of parentage and childhood.
What do you think his release would signify? Does it feel like finally a closing chapter? Is it just the beginning of this closing chapter that is never ending?
It's very interesting. I'm in Afghanistan where people have returned. Asadullah Harun, for example, came back after almost 20 years without charge or trial. He's home. And the advice that he gives to anybody like Mohammed Raheem is that what's happened to us, we were in a dark hole, and that hole you'll never forget, but move forward. But you can't move forward without getting released, you see, and that's the first thing that has to happen with Mohammed Raheem. There's thousands of people who were held in Bagram. I feel insignificant. I feel my role, whatever happened to me, is insignificant compared to what these people have gone through. So Raheem's release will put an end to what is one of the darkest chapters in US and Afghan history. Afghans constituted the largest number of prisoners held, not just in Bagram, but also in Guantanamo. And the country needs to recover. And that recovery, I think, will start with children being reunited with their parents.
Well, you were talking about you being one of a multitude of people who were held in both Bagram and Guantanamo. In the film, it almost comes across as an odd fellowship of sorts. There's a moment where you're sitting around with the son of Mohammed Raheem, as well as other friends, I guess you would call them. They're friends now, former detainees. You're comforting each other. You're talking about what it would mean for Mohammed Raheem to be released. And there are also references to the fact that fellow former Guantanamo inmates are now in the Ministry of Defense and in the Ministry of Interior. And this is in the Taliban-led government in Afghanistan. Talk to me about this club that you find yourself in.
It's a club not of our making. It's a club that was hoisted upon us and thrust upon us. And therefore now, there's only about 800 people, or 779 to be exact, in the whole world who have been imprisoned in Guantanamo. So it's automatically a very exclusive club. There's a common experience, a shared experience. And the primary experience is that you were held without charge or trial by the world's most powerful advocate of democracy and human rights, which is the greatest irony. And therefore, wherever you look around the world, you'll see that you'll try to help and assist in whatever way you can. That's no different for the ministers in this country, whether it's the head of intelligence, whether it's the deputy head of the interior, deputy head of the military, orders agencies, whichever it is. And I didn't know them before, but they've offered help I've gone to see them about Raheem's case. I've gone to see them about other cases. Now we're walking the streets of Kabul together. We're visiting Bagram together, trying to uncover the cases of others who are still there in Guantanamo and elsewhere. And so these former prisoners of the United States of America are the ones that are facilitating it because they're now in a position of power to be able to do so.
Now in a position of power, talk to me about what that must feel like, that the Taliban have returned to power after all of these years and all that's happened to Afghanistan. We're back here. How do you think the scars of war and detention have shaped life in Afghanistan today, keeping in mind that the Taliban are back where they were before the US-led invasion?
Well, I'd say they're not back where they were. They're far, far stronger. They are far more organized. They are far more committed, I think, from what I'm saying in terms of the morale. And what that means with the Taliban being back in power is one thing that I see across the board is people want peace. They don't want any more war. There are problems, of course, that's evident that there's problems in relation to education, in relation to minorities, in relation to female education and beyond that. But there's peace, there's security. The markets are full. People are coming in and going out of the country regular. And I know because I've done it myself a few times. So if they didn't like the Taliban, they shouldn't have invaded this country and caused them to become stronger than they've ever been in their history.
So, Moazzam, during your time in Afghanistan, you asked other former detainees about how they got over the pain of that experience. What would your advice be to Mohammed Raheem and others after everything you've gone through?
I don't think I'm in a position to advise somebody who spent 5-6 times longer in Guantanamo than I have. I think what he's gone through is going to be very unique to his circumstances. The only thing I would perhaps say to him is to look at his relationships, his mother, his children, his brothers. Things have moved on for them. Life has moved on, and you will inevitably remain in the place where you were, and time stopped for you the moment that you were detained. It didn't stop for them. They kept on. And you've been a very important part of their lives. They will never and have not forgotten you. But you must be easy upon them, and they will be easy upon you.
And what would justice look like for you?
Ultimately, if we live in a world where we believe that everyone is subject to the law equally, then that must manifest itself. If it doesn't, then it's just lip service. And in my estimation, I've been involved in a multitude of legal cases, whether it's giving evidence to the International Criminal Court for the role of the United States in the torture and abuse of prisoners in Bagram, whether it's giving evidence at a judge-led inquiry in the United Kingdom. I have found that those involved in our abuse are literally above the law. So justice will never be done. Never.
And that's The Take. To watch the full documentary, Echoes of Bagram, check out the link in our episode notes. This episode was produced by Miranda Lynn with Khaled Soltan, Noor Wazwaz, Chloe K. Lee, and me, Malika Bilal. It was edited by Alexandra Locke. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.